The chandeliers dripped light, like cold diamonds, scattering fractured rainbows across the cavernous ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum. The air, thick with the scent of hothouse lilies and expensive perfume, hummed with the discreet murmur of old money and new power. It was the annual Metropolitan Benefactors Gala, the apex of New York's philanthropic season, a gilded cage where influence was the currency and reputations were traded over canapes. Alara Vance stood near the dais, a statue carved from obsidian and nerve. Her gown, a column of midnight blue silk, was deceptively simple, drawing the eye not with glitter, but with its perfect, severe lines. It was a statement of intent. She was not here to blend in. She was here to be seen. Her posture was immaculate, her expression a carefully composed mask of polite interest. But inside, a familiar coldness was coiling in her stomach. She was being honored tonight, the Vanguard Award, for her firm's revolutionary impact on ethical investing and urban renewal. It was a triumph, the culmination of a decade spent clawing her way back from an abyss that had nearly swallowed her whole. Yet, the clinking of champagne flutes sounded like brittle applause, and the smiles of the city's elite felt like the bared teeth of predators. The master of ceremonies, a man with a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, was concluding his introduction. And so, it is my distinct honor to present this year's Vanguard Award to a true titan of industry, a woman who has redefined resilience, Ms. Alara Vance. A wave of polite applause washed over her. She ascended the 2 shallow steps to the stage, the silk of her gown whispering against the marble. She accepted the heavy crystal award, her fingers cool and steady. She smiled, a practiced, perfect arc of her lips that did not reach her eyes. "Thank you," she began, her voice calm and clear, carrying effortlessly through the grand hall. "It is an honor to be recognized among such distinguished company. The work we do at Vance Sterling is driven by a simple belief that capital can be a force for creation, not just acquisition, that we can build communities, not just portfolios." She was about to continue, to deliver the concise, powerful speech she and her assistant, Carla, had rehearsed, when a figure rose from the most prominent table at the front. Julian Thorne. A collective intake of breath seemed to ripple through the room. Julian Thorne did not simply attend events, he presided over them. As the CEO of Aegis International, a sprawling global conglomerate, he was less a man and more a gravitational force, pulling all light and attention toward himself. He was handsome, in a cruel, angular way. His silver-streaked hair and impeccably tailored tuxedo, making him look like a Roman emperor surveying his domain. He raised his glass, a shark's smile playing on his lips. "If I may," he said, his voice a silken baritone that commanded immediate silence. "I feel I must add a personal word. As a contemporary of Ms. Vance, I have watched her career with profound admiration." Alara's heart did not beat faster. It seemed to stop altogether. She kept the smile fixed on her face, a shield against the poison she knew was coming. "Some of you may know," Julian continued, his gaze sweeping the room before landing, with surgical precision, on Alara, that Ms. Vance's journey has been nothing short of miraculous. To rise from the ashes, as she has, requires a truly unique character. We all remember the tragedy of the Phoenix Project. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into a silent pool. The polite smiles of the audience tightened. The Phoenix Project was a ghost, a decade-old scar on the city's conscience, a catastrophic structural failure in a groundbreaking urban redevelopment venture that had resulted in immense loss and a firestorm of litigation. It was the abyss from which Alara had emerged. Julian's smile widened. A masterpiece of feigned sympathy. A lesser person would have been destroyed by such a misfortune. To be at the helm of a project that ended in such disappointment. The lawsuits, the public disgrace. It would have broken anyone. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Each one a carefully aimed dart. But not Alara. She possesses a rare ability to compartmentalize, to move on, leaving the past and its entanglements behind her. She simply shed her old skin and began anew. A remarkable recovery from past misfortunes. Indeed. To the uninitiated, it sounded like a toast to her strength. A tribute. But Alara heard the subtext. The coded language forged in the crucible of their shared history. Ashes, misfortune, entanglements. He wasn't praising her resilience. He was reminding her, and anyone in the room who remembered the old headlines, that she was a creature born of disaster. He was painting her as a cold, detached survivor who had walked away from ruin without a scratch, leaving others to pay the price. He was reminding her of a guilt he himself had branded upon her. The silence in the ballroom was now absolute, heavy and watchful. Every eye was on her, waiting for a reaction. A crack in the facade, a flicker of pain, a flash of anger. Alara gave them nothing. She held his gaze, her expression unchanged. The crystal award in her hand felt impossibly heavy, a monument to a victory that suddenly felt hollow. She inclined her head, a gesture of regal, chilling calm. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice a sliver of ice, "for your singular perspective. It's so rare to find someone who remembers the details of ancient history with such clarity." With that, she turned back to the audience, the serene mask perfectly in place. She finished her speech, her words flowing with the same measured grace as before. But the room had changed. The air was charged with unspoken questions. The gilded cage suddenly felt much smaller, and the predator who had rattled its bars was still smiling. His victory assured. He had not drawn blood, but he had reminded her, and the world, of the wounds that lay just beneath the silk, and in doing so, he had declared that their war, the one that had been cold for a decade, was about to turn hot once more. The ride back to her penthouse in the chauffeured town car was a study in silence. The glittering skyline of Manhattan slid past the tinted windows, a city of a million lights that felt distant and cold. Alara stared out at the indifferent architecture, the crystal award resting on the leather seat beside her like a cold, silent accusation. The mask she wore for the world had been set aside. In the shadowed interior of the car, her face was drawn, her eyes holding the deep, haunted look of someone reliving a nightmare. Julian's words echoed in her mind, not as an insult, but as a pronouncement. The past. Entanglements. He was reopening the tomb she had spent 10 years sealing shut. Her apartment was a sanctuary of minimalist design, cool tones, clean lines, and vast windows that offered a god's-eye view of Central Park. It was a space designed for control, for order. Everything had its place. Everything was intentional. It was the antithesis of the chaos that had once defined her life. Carla was waiting for her, a glass of water in hand. Carla Mendoza was more than Alara's executive assistant. She was her fortress wall, her strategist, and the only person on earth who had seen her break. With her sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that could wither a boastful CEO at 20 paces, Carla was the operational engine of Alara's life. "He didn't even wait for the dessert course," Carla said, her voice tight with fury as Alara slipped off her heels. He couldn't resist. A snake has to be a snake. It wasn't an impulse. Carla. It was a calculated move, Ilara said, her voice flat. She walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. The city lights below blurred into a hazy river of gold. He was testing the waters, reminding everyone of the narrative he created. The narrative he bought, Carla corrected, her tone sharp. He hired the best PR firm in the country to make sure his name was scrubbed clean, while yours was dragged through the mud for years. Ilara didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew the history. Ilara Vance, the brilliant young architect with a vision for the future. Julian Thorne, the ambitious scion of a real estate dynasty, her business partner. Together, they had launched the Phoenix Project, a revolutionary mixed-use development meant to revitalize a forgotten corner of the city. It was to be their legacy. Instead, it became her ruin. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through her composure. The smell of wet concrete and dust, the grinding sound of stressed steel, the sickening lurch as the West Tower, still a skeleton against the sky, gave way. The screams, the sirens, the aftermath. She flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. The nightmares had faded over the years, but they had never truly gone away. They were ghosts that lived in the quiet hours of the night, whispering of failure and betrayal. The Board of Aegis is getting restless, Ilara said, turning from the window, her mind already shifting from emotion to strategy. It was her primary defense mechanism. His profit margins have been slipping for 2 quarters. He needs a distraction, a show of strength. Attacking me is his favorite way to do that. It makes him feel powerful. It's more than that. And you know it. Carla pressed gently. This isn't just business for him. It's an obsession. He can't stand seeing you succeed. Every award you win, every building your firm finances, is a reminder that he didn't destroy you completely. Ilara walked to a recessed panel in the wall. She pressed her thumb to a biometric scanner, and the panel slid open, revealing not a safe, but a single, framed photograph. It was of her and Julian, a decade younger, standing on the construction site of the Phoenix Project. They were smiling, hard hats on, blueprints clutched in their hands. They looked like conquerors, full of the fierce, unblinking optimism of youth. They looked like they believed they could build a better world. She stared at the image of the man who had been her partner, her friend, and ultimately, her Judas. He had stood beside her in front of the press and the inquiry boards, his face a mask of sorrow, and methodically fed them the story that saved himself. That Ilara, the lead architect, in her ambitious rush, had signed off on flawed engineering reports and ignored critical safety warnings. He had evidence emails, documents, reports, all of it carefully, brilliantly forged. She had been publicly crucified. Her career was obliterated. She was buried in lawsuits and debt. Julian, the grieving but responsible businessman, had walked away, his family's lawyers ensuring his name remained synonymous with vision, not negligence. He wants to erase me, Ilara whispered, the words barely audible. He's not content with me just being gone. He wants the world to believe I never should have existed in the first place. Carla came to stand beside her. Then we don't let him. For 10 years, you've played defense. You've rebuilt. You've become untouchable. Maybe it's time to play offense. Ilara traced the glass over Julian's smiling face in the photograph. The coldness in her stomach was crystallizing, hardening from a dull ache into something sharp, something purposeful. He thinks the past is his weapon, she said, her voice losing its fragile edge and taking on the familiar, chilling calm she wore in the boardroom. He's about to find out it's mine. She slid the panel shut, hiding the ghost of the past away once more. The battle had been declared in a room full of glitter and lies. The war would be fought in the shadows, where the truth had been buried for a decade. The declaration of war arrived 3 days later, not with a trumpet blast, but with the sterile, emotionless prose of a financial filing. Carla placed the tablet on Alara's desk, her expression grim. "It's a hostile takeover bid," Carla stated, the words hanging in the air of Alara's sun-drenched office. "A shell corporation. Orion Acquisitions has made an offer to buy a controlling stake in Vance Sterling. They're offering 20% above market value." Alara read the filing, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. Her office, unlike Thorne's reputed glass and steel mausoleum, was a space of warmth and quiet strength. It was filled with art by emerging female artists, and architectural models of the community centers and affordable housing projects her firm had financed. It was a room that spoke of creation. "Orion Acquisitions," Alara murmured, tapping the screen. "Untraceable. Of course, funded by a series of offshore accounts." "I've already got our tech team running traces," Carla said, pacing in front of the desk. "But we both know where the money leads. It smells like Julian." "It's more than a smell. It's his signature," Alara replied, her gaze distant, overwhelmed with a generous offer to sow dissent among the shareholders. Create chaos. Then, when the stock price is volatile, move in for the kill with a lower, more aggressive bid. It's his playbook. This was a direct assault on her life's work. Vance Sterling was not just a company to her. It was her resurrection. She had built it from the ashes of the Phoenix Project, starting with a tiny loan and a handful of clients who were willing to take a chance on a pariah. She had built it on a foundation of principles Julian would never understand: transparency, community, and the belief that wealth had a responsibility. "Our board is loyal," Alara said, more to herself than to Carla. "But 20% above market is tempting. Some of our early investors might be looking for an exit." "We need to fight back. A press release, a counteroffer." "No," Alara said, her voice firm. "A public fight is what he wants. He controls the media landscape. He'll paint me as desperate, incompetent. He'll drag the Phoenix Project out all over again. We can't fight him on his turf." She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city that had once cast her out. "We fight him on ours." She turned back to Carla, a new, cold clarity in her eyes. "He thinks this is about money. He thinks he can buy my life's work. He doesn't understand. This was never about the money. It's about the narrative. He wrote the first chapter of my public life. I'm going to write the last chapter of his." Her instructions were precise, the strategic part of her brain clicking into place, overriding the residual sting of Julian's gala performance. "Carla, I want you to start a deep dive. Not on Orion. That's a dead end. I want you to dig into Aegis International, every filing, every contract, every acquisition for the last 10 years. Look for patterns, for vulnerabilities. Julian is arrogant. Arrogant men get sloppy." "Already on it," Carla said, a grim smile touching her lips. "I've been waiting for this call for a decade." "And get in touch with David Chen." Carla's eyebrows shot up. "David, the journalist, Alara. He's just a kid." "He's not a kid anymore," Alara corrected. "He's one of the sharpest investigative reporters at the Chronicle. And he owes me. I gave him his first internship when no one else would touch him." More importantly, David was clean. He was hungry, idealistic, and not yet jaded by the city's corrosive politics. He would see a story, not a power play. "What do you want him to look into?" Carla asked. "The Phoenix Project," Alara said, the words tasting like ash. "Not the collapse, the aftermath, the land deals, the insurance payouts. The subcontractors who declared bankruptcy overnight. I want him to follow the money. All the money that disappeared while the world was busy watching me burn. Carla nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just a defense. This was a counteroffensive, aimed at the very foundation of Julian Thorne's empire. He's declared war. Carla, Alara said softly, her gaze fixed on the skyline. He just doesn't realize I've been preparing for it for 10 years. The first salvo from Julian's side was not financial, but reputational. It came in the form of a Sunday feature in the New York Chronicle, the city's most influential newspaper, a paper in which Julian Thorne held a significant, though not controlling, interest. The headline was a masterpiece of insinuation. The phoenix and the flame can Alara Vance's Midas touch, outrun her troubled past. The article, penned by a veteran business columnist known for his sharp tongue, was a character assassination disguised as a profile. It lauded her success with Vance Sterling, calling her a formidable force in modern finance. But every paragraph of praise was immediately undercut by a paragraph of carefully curated doubt. It rehashed the Phoenix Project disaster in lurid detail, quoting anonymous sources who spoke of Alara's blinding ambition and reckless oversight. It twisted her comeback into a narrative of cold, calculated survival. It painted her philanthropy as a public relations stunt to launder a guilty conscience. The most damning part was a leaked excerpt from a sealed deposition from a decade ago. One Julian's lawyers had surely provided, in it, a younger. Distraught, Alara admitted to being overwhelmed and working under immense pressure. Taken out of context, her vulnerability was reframed as an admission of incompetence. Alara read the article in her quiet apartment, the morning sun streaming in, illuminating the fine print of her public execution. She felt a cold, familiar dread creep up her spine. The ghost of the young woman who had been flayed in the press so many years ago. The phone calls started almost immediately. Anxious investors, concerned board members, friends offering cautious, hesitant support. The smear was working. It was planting the seed of doubt, making her seem unstable, a risky bet. It was the preamble to his takeover, designed to soften her defenses and isolate her. Carla was livid, pacing Alara's office like a caged tiger. This is his media machine in full swing. He's using his leverage at the Chronicle to poison the well. We have to issue a statement, a rebuttal. And say what Alara countered, her voice dangerously calm. That the anonymous sources are lies, that the deposition is taken out of context. It would make me sound defensive and guilty. No. We don't respond to the smear. We change the story. She dialed David Chen. They met in a small, out-of-the-way coffee shop in the West Village, far from the prying eyes of the financial district. David had the lean, hungry look of a reporter on the rise. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and held a deep, abiding respect for the woman sitting opposite him. Alara had mentored him years ago, seeing a raw talent and an unshakable integrity that was rare in their world. I read the piece in the Chronicle, David said, his voice low. It was a hatchet job. Alara. They were quoting from sealed records. I know, she said, taking a sip of her tea. That's why I called you. Julian Thorne thinks he owns the past. I want you to prove him wrong. She laid it out for him. Not the story of her personal betrayal, but the trail of financial breadcrumbs she wanted him to follow. Start with the subcontractors for the Phoenix Project. Specifically, a company called Titan Steel. They supplied the structural rebar. They declared bankruptcy 2 weeks after the collapse. Their records conveniently lost in a warehouse fire. David's eyes lit up with the thrill of the chase. A fire. How convenient. Exactly, Alara said. Then look at the insurance claims. Aegis Construction, Julian's division, was the primary contractor. Their insurance payout was record-breaking. Where did that money go? It certainly didn't go to the victims' funds or the smaller businesses that were ruined. She slid a memory stick across the table. This is my preliminary research. Bank records I managed to unseal. Corporate filings. It's a starting point. I need someone with your skills. Someone outside my world. To connect the dots. David picked up the drive, his expression serious. Why me, Alara? You could hire the best private investigators in the world. Because they can be bought, she said simply. Julian's reach is long. I need someone who values the truth more than a paycheck. I believe you're that person. David, am I wrong? He met her gaze. A flicker of the idealistic intern she remembered shining in his eyes. No, you're not wrong. He paused, his journalistic instincts kicking in. What's your angle in this? What do you get out of me digging this up? Alara allowed herself a small, cold smile. Julian Thorne is trying to destroy my company. He's using the past to do it. I'm just providing the public with a more complete historical record. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. This was not just about saving her company. This was about reclaiming her name, and she was willing to burn down Julian Thorne's empire to do it. While David began his quiet investigation, Alara and Carla focused on the corporate war. They worked relentlessly, digging into the financials of Aegis International. Late nights bled into early mornings, the office fueled by coffee and a cold, simmering rage. They were looking for a crack in the fortress. And then they found it. It was buried deep in the filings of an obscure subsidiary in South America, a company involved in rare earth mineral extraction, a pattern of payments large, irregular transfers to government officials, disguised as consulting fees. This is it, Carla breathed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. It's bribery. Plain and simple. He's been bribing foreign officials to secure mining rights, violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This is a federal crime. Alara stared at the screen, at the numbers that spelled out Julian's secret. He had gotten sloppy. His arrogance had made him believe he was untouchable. This was the weapon she needed, anonymously leaked. It would trigger a federal investigation that could cripple Aegis. But, as she mapped out the strategy, a more disturbing pattern began to emerge from Carla's research. It started with a small, independent coffee chain, whose flagship store was in the lobby of Alara's main office building. Orion Acquisitions, Thorne's shell company, had bought them out. Then, a non-profit arts foundation Alara had personally endowed Orion had made a massive donation, securing 2 seats on its board. Then, a tech startup she had mentored, a small urban garden she had funded. One by one, the small, meaningful pieces of the life she had built were being quietly, systematically absorbed by Julian's shadow company. The realization hit Alara with the force of a physical blow. She stood in her office, looking at the map Carla had created, a web of connections all leading back to Orion. My God, she whispered, it's not a takeover. Carla looked up, her expression confused. What are you talking about? Of course it is. No, Alara said, her voice trembling slightly. A takeover of Vance Sterling would be a business victory. This is something else. He's not targeting my company. Carla, he's targeting my life. He's buying the coffee shop where I get my morning latte. He's infiltrating the charity I support. He's trying to own every part of my world. The cold, strategic calm she had maintained for weeks shattered, replaced by a profound, chilling dread. This wasn't about profit margins or corporate dominance. Julian's goal was not to win. It was to erase her. He wanted to dismantle, piece by piece, the entire world she had so painstakingly constructed, until there was nothing left of her but the ruin he had made a decade ago. It was an act of profound, psychological cruelty. "He wants to leave me with nothing," Alara said, the words catching in her throat. "Nowhere to go where he doesn't own a piece of it. He's not trying to buy my company. He's trying to buy my soul." The fight had just become infinitely more personal. This was no longer a war for her business. It was a war for her very existence. And she was losing. The threat materialized on a Tuesday afternoon. David Chen called, his voice strained, stripped of its usual journalistic bravado. "Alara, we have a problem. A big one." They met at their usual spot. David looked haggard, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. He slid a folder across the table. It contained a draft of an article from a notorious online tabloid, the kind that specialized in character assassination. The headline was "Explosive Journalist for Sale David Chen's Conflict of Interest in the Thorn Takedown." The article was a web of fabricated claims and distorted truths. It alleged that David was not an objective journalist, but a paid operative of Alara Vance, hired to smear Julian Thorn. It included manufactured emails between David and a fictitious source, and bank statements cleverly forged showing large payments from an offshore account linked to Vance Sterling. It even hinted at a personal relationship between him and Alara. "They're going to run with it tomorrow," David said, his voice raw. "My editor at the Chronicle got an anonymous tip. He's putting my investigation on hold. I'm facing an internal review. They're going to destroy me. Alara." Alara felt a vice of ice tighten around her chest. This was Julian's retaliation. He had found out about David's digging, and had moved not to block the investigation, but to obliterate the investigator. He was making an example of David. He was showing Alara that anyone who helped her would be burned. He was isolating her, forcing her into a choice between her quest for justice and the career of a young man she had sworn to protect. "He's using you to get to me," she said, her hands clenching into fists under the table. "This is a warning." "It's more than a warning. It's a kill shot," David said, his voice cracking. "My reputation, my career, it's all I have. If this story runs, I'm finished. No one will ever trust me again." The weight of the choice pressed down on her. She could push forward, leak the evidence of Julian's bribery, and, in the ensuing inferno, David's story would become a footnote, but his career would be collateral damage, his name forever tainted. Or she could back down, call off the investigation, and let Julian win. He would consume her company, her life, and her legacy. But David would be spared. For a moment, she was tempted to sacrifice him. The part of her that had been forged in betrayal, the part that whispered survival, was all that mattered, urged her to press the attack. But then, she looked at David's face, at the genuine fear and despair in his eyes. She saw the reflection of the idealistic young intern she had once taken under her wing. Protecting him was not a strategic liability. It was a moral imperative. To sacrifice him would be to become the kind of person Julian was. "No," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "He is not going to destroy you, and he is not going to win." A new plan began to form in her mind, audacious and incredibly risky. Julian thought he was forcing her to choose between revenge and morality. He didn't realize she was capable of choosing both. "David, I need you to do exactly as I say," she instructed, her eyes alight with a dangerous fire. "First, you are going to go back to your editor. You are going to tell him you're dropping the investigation into Thorn, effective immediately. You'll say the leads went cold. David stared at her, aghast. What? But I'm close. The Titan Steel connection is real. I found the owner, living in seclusion in Florida. He's scared, but he's willing to talk. I know, Ilara said, and he will. But not to you. Not yet. Right now. Your priority is to survive. You need to make Thorne believe he's won. Make him think he's successfully intimidated you into silence. And then, would I just let him get away with it? No, Ilara said, a predatory calm settling over her. Then, you give me everything you have. Every note, every document, every interview transcript, especially your interview with the owner of Titan Steel. She leaned forward, her voice a low, intense whisper. Julian thinks he's taken your weapon away from you. He's about to find out he just handed it to me. She would not leak the story through a journalist. She would not use an anonymous tip. She would deliver the killing blow herself, not in the shadows of the media, but in the brightest, most public arena imaginable. He had threatened her ally, trying to force her into a defensive crouch. Instead, he had just given her the final piece of ammunition she needed. The war was no longer about defense or even about revenge. It was about annihilation. The grand ballroom of the Hilton Midtown was electric with anticipation. It was the day of the Aegis International Annual Shareholder Meeting, the crown jewel of Julian Thorne's corporate calendar. The event was a spectacle of power. Broadcast live on every major financial network. 1,000 attendees, investors, analysts, and journalists filled the room, their faces upturned toward the massive stage where a triumphant Julian Thorne was about to deliver his keynote address. Ilara sat in the fifth row, an island of stillness in a sea of motion. She was not there as Ilara Vance, CEO of a rival firm. She was there as the designated proxy for a small but significant block of shareholders, a silent coalition of investors she and Carla had spent weeks cultivating, all of whom had been burned or betrayed by Julian Thorne in the past. They had given her their voice. Carla sat beside her, a tablet glowing on her lap, a direct link to their war room. David Chen was watching the live stream from a secure location, ready to publish his complete, corroborated findings the moment Ilara gave the signal. On stage, Julian was in his element. He moved with the easy confidence of a king, his speech painting a glorious picture of Aegis's global dominance and future prosperity. He was a master showman, and the audience was captivated. And so, he concluded, his voice resonating with manufactured passion, as we look to the future, we see a horizon of limitless potential, a new era of growth, innovation, and unparalleled success. Aegis is not just a company, it is a promise of strength, stability, and victory. He smiled, basking in the thunderous applause. He then opened the floor for the Q&A session, a standard, carefully managed part of the proceedings. This was her moment. Ilara stood. A camera immediately swiveled to find her. A murmur rippled through the room as people recognized her. Julian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He had not expected her here. "Mr. Thorne," Ilara began, her voice amplified by the microphone brought to her by an attendant. It was perfectly level, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more commanding. Ilara Vance, representing the Minerva Trust Investment Group. "Mizzy Vance," Julian replied, his tone dripping with condescending surprise. "An unexpected pleasure. To what do we owe this honor?" "I have a question about your keynote," she said. "You spoke of strength and stability, but I believe a company's true strength lies not just in its balance sheets, but in its history, in the integrity of its foundation." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. So I'd like to talk about one of your earliest, foundational projects. A project that I believe defines the true character of this company. I'd like to talk about the Phoenix Project. A collective gasp swept the room. The name was taboo. A ghost Julian had long since exorcised from his corporate narrative. Julian's face hardened, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the cold fury beneath. "That is ancient history, Mrs. Vance," he said dismissively. "A tragic but closed chapter. I hardly see its relevance to our Q4 projections." "Its relevance," Ilara said, her voice as sharp as a scalpel, "is fraud." The room erupted, shouts, gasps, the frantic clicking of cameras. Julian's face went pale. "That is a slanderous and baseless accusation," he thundered from the stage. "Security, remove this woman." But it was too late. The hook was set. "Is it baseless, Mr.?" Thorne Ilara continued, her voice rising effortlessly above the din. "Or is it a truth you've spent a decade and millions of dollars to bury?" On the massive screens flanking the stage, where Julian's face had been moments before, a new image appeared. Carla, with perfect timing, had hacked the presentation feed. It was a scanned document, a materials invoice from a company called Titan Steel. "This is the original purchase order for the structural steel rebar for the Phoenix Project's West Tower," Ilara announced. "And this." The image changed to a second document, is the revised, falsified invoice submitted to the city inspectors. An invoice you personally signed, Mr. Thorne, which approved the use of cheaper, substandard steel that failed to meet safety codes. You saved $3 million on materials. A rounding error for your company, but a fatal flaw for the building. The room was in stunned silence. Julian stared at the screen, his mouth agape. The original records were thought to be destroyed in a warehouse fire. Ilara went on, her voice relentless. But the owner of Titan Steel kept a private copy. He has been living in fear for 10 years. His sworn, videotaped testimony was delivered to the SEC and the district attorney's office 1 hour ago. She was not just presenting data. She was telling a story. Her story. "You framed a young, ambitious architect for your crime," she said, her eyes locking with Julian's across the crowded room. "You destroyed her reputation to save your own. But your crime wasn't just about greed. Was it? Julian. It was about guilt." This was the major twist, the blow from which he would not recover. "You couldn't live with what you had done, the corner you cut, the lives that were impacted. So you projected that guilt onto me. For 10 years. Your vendetta against me hasn't been about business rivalry. It's been a desperate, pathological attempt to silence the one person left in the world who knows the truth of what you are. You needed to believe I was the monster, because you couldn't stand to look at the one in your own mirror." Julian was shaking now, his face a mask of rage and terror. "Lies, all of it. Lies." "Is it?" Ilara asked softly. And then she delivered the final, devastating blow, the secondary twist that would cost her, but would cement his doom. "But I am not without fault," she said, her voice dropping, forcing the entire room to lean in. "And this is what you never counted on. That I would tell the whole truth." A new document appeared on the screen, one of her own original architectural schematics. She had circled a section in red. "This was my design," she said, her voice clear and steady, filled with a pain that was a decade old, but still sharp. "And this was my mistake. A miscalculation in the load-bearing distribution for the western support columns. It was a flaw that a proper grade of steel would have compensated for. A flaw that the substandard steel you ordered turned into a catastrophe. My mistake made the disaster possible. Your fraud made it inevitable." The room was utterly silent. By admitting her own culpability, she had made her accusation against him unimpeachable. It was no longer the word of a rival. It was the confession of a participant, one who was finally setting the record straight, regardless of the cost to herself. She was not just a victim. She was a witness. "You built your empire on a foundation of lies and faulty steel. Julian," she concluded, her voice ringing with the clarity of judgment, "and today, it all comes down." In the aftermath of her words, there was a moment of profound silence. And then, chaos. The stock ticker for Aegis International, visible on a side screen, began to nosedive in real time. Board members were scrambling onto the stage, their faces ashen. Julian Thorne stood frozen, a fallen emperor on a crumbling stage, exposed and utterly defeated in front of the entire world. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Aegis International stock went into freefall, triggering a market-wide halt. By the time trading resumed, billions had been wiped from its valuation. The board convened an emergency meeting and, before the day was out, Julian Thorne was stripped of his title as CEO. The SEC and the District Attorney's Office publicly confirmed they had opened formal investigations into both Aegis International and Julian Thorne for fraud, conspiracy, and bribery. His empire was not just crumbling. It was being dismantled by the very systems he had once manipulated with such ease. Alara watched the news unfold from the quiet of her office, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly draining away, leaving a profound and complicated exhaustion in its wake. Her own confession had created its own storm. News outlets were running a dual narrative: Thorne the criminal, and Vance the brilliant but flawed architect who had finally come clean. Some hailed her as a hero, a whistleblower of incredible courage. Others condemned her, dredging up the old accusations, arguing that her admission of a design flaw proved she was always partially to blame. She had not achieved a clean, simple victory. She had won the war, but at the cost of revealing her own scars to the world. And yet, she felt no regret. For the first time in a decade, the narrative was hers. The truth, in all its messy, painful complexity, was out. Carla walked in, placing a steaming mug of tea on her desk. "The board of Vance Sterling just concluded their emergency session," she said, her voice soft. "It was a unanimous vote of confidence. They're standing with you, Alara, all of them." A wave of relief washed over Alara, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. She had braced herself for desertion, for the cold calculus of business to turn against her. But her honesty had earned her something more valuable than a pristine reputation loyalty. Later that evening, David Chen came to her office. The tabloid story had been killed, his name cleared by the tidal wave of Alara's revelations at the shareholder meeting. The Chronicle had offered him a front-page story to publish his full, unvarnished investigation. He was no longer a victim of the story. He was its author. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You risked everything to tell the truth. You saved my career. You were willing to risk it for the truth first." "David," she replied, managing a small, genuine smile. "I just finished what you started. Now go write the story that needs to be written." After he left, Alara stood alone by the window, looking out at the city lights. The victory felt less like a celebration and more like the quiet, aching peace after a long and brutal storm. She had destroyed Julian Thorne. She had avenged her past. But the cost had been real. Exposing her own failure had been terrifying. A final act of shedding the armor she had worn for so long. In her quest for revenge, she had been forced to confront the ghost of her own fallibility. And in doing so, She realized her goal had shifted. It was no longer about destroying an enemy. It was about reclaiming herself, the whole, imperfect, resilient self she had kept hidden for so long. The war was over, but the work of rebuilding had just begun. 6 months later. The autumn air was crisp and cool. Alara stood on a windswept, empty lot overlooking the river. The skeletal remains of rusted rebar and crumbling concrete foundations were all that was left of the Phoenix Project. For a decade, this place had been a blight, a monument to failure and tragedy, fenced off and forgotten by the city. It was a place of ghosts. Today, it was a place of new beginnings. A small crowd had gathered journalists, community leaders, and the families of those affected by the disaster all those years ago. A simple stage and podium had been erected. Alara, dressed in a simple but elegant cream-colored coat, stepped up to the microphone. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but her voice was strong and clear, carrying over the hum of the city. For 10 years, this ground has been a symbol of a promise broken, she began, her gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. It has stood for failure, for loss, and for a pain that this community has carried for too long. I know that pain. I carry a piece of it myself. She spoke of her role in the tragedy with unvarnished honesty. Not as an excuse, but as a testament. She acknowledged her mistake, the flaw in her design, and the heavy weight of that responsibility. Vengeance, she said, her voice softening, can be a powerful motivator. But I have learned that it is a hollow victory if it ends with the destruction of your enemy. True victory, true empowerment, is not about tearing down. It's about building up. She gestured to the desolate landscape around them. That is why I am here today. Vengeance gave me back my past. Now, I want to use it to build a future. Today, Vance Sterling, in partnership with the city, is announcing the launch of the Phoenix Foundation. We are committing an initial $100 million to redevelop this land, but we will not be building luxury condos or corporate headquarters. We will be building a community. A murmur of surprise and excitement spread through the crowd. We will build affordable housing for families, she continued, her voice ringing with passion. A state-of-the-art vocational school to create jobs, a public park, a library, and a community arts center, and at its heart, we will build a memorial, a quiet, beautiful space dedicated to the memory of those who were lost here, so that we never forget the human cost of ambition without conscience. She was turning the symbol of her greatest failure, the source of Julian Thorne's decade-long betrayal, into a monument of her rebirth. She was not erasing the past. She was redeeming it. She was transforming a place of pain into a symbol of healing, proving that, from the deepest ashes, something new and beautiful could rise. This was her true victory, not the destruction of Julian Thorne, but the creation of a legacy built on truth, accountability, and hope. As she finished speaking, a tentative, then growing, wave of applause rose to meet her. It was not the brittle, polite applause of the gala. It was warm, genuine, and full of a hope she had not allowed herself to feel for a very long time. She looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, the colors of a fire, not of destruction, but of renewal.